Hey everyone, welcome back to Bourbon and Banter. Today we are going to dive into supply chain. I know that's probably one of the most overused words of the past 12 months, but we're going to break down not only what it means and where supply chain is really going in industry, but how companies can better prepare themselves for what's to come, what's already happened, and what lies ahead. So without further ado, buddy, let's get into it.
I love that, Alex. It's funny for me to even have this conversation because a decade ago, I couldn't get anybody to care about the supply chain, and now you can't get people to stop talking about the supply chain. So I'm happy that it's in the news. I'm happy that we're identifying issues and problems, and people are trying to figure out how to not only deal with them, but thrive in these uncertain times. So
yeah, I don't think anybody even thought about supply chain. You just, when you needed something, it was there, whether it was the gas you put in your car, the food you put in your pantry. You showed up, you paid a reasonable price for it, and you took it home. And, the pandemic, among other things, really turned the supply chain upside down.
Absolutely.
And I think people started to understand the complexity, all the interdependencies within a supply chain, and the needle movers, what can impact supply chain, and material shortages, transportation backlogs, demand swings, monetary policy, regulation. You start to look at all these things, and it's like any one of those could impact a supply chain, and every one of those things has impacted the supply chain over the past year.
All at once.
So yep. where do we dive in? Because it's a mess. I mean, we know it from a consumer standpoint because we see people getting shipments for Christmas decorations in January. But when you look at the business side of things, companies are dealing with backlogged orders. They're having to manage their customers' expectations while they're dealing with, maybe it's an overseas supplier, or maybe their stuff's just sitting at a port. Where do you want to peel back the onion first?
Yeah, it's a big onion. Yeah, that's the thing about the supply chain is there's no one central way to solve the issue. There is a plethora of issues that surround the supply chain, and like you stated earlier, I mean, they all have an impact. And we don't see it until we physically see it. It's either in a price hike, or it's in transportation and logistics, or it's in just the sheer unavailability. Right? Hey, I used to be able to walk in and get whatever I needed, and now it's no longer there.
Well, here's something that just made me think of is, what was it, 3 years ago when all the tariffs came into play? Do you remember that? It feels like it was a century ago that the tariffs on China were a thing, but that was one of the first sort of supply chain impacts, because now prices were going up because tariffs, as we know, are really not a tax on the country. It ends up being a price hike to the company that's importing those products, which is generally then passed along to a consumer.
That's correct.
And then so businesses start looking at alternatives, and sometimes the alternative is also more expensive than just sourcing something from China or from another Asian country, if that's even possible. So I think it's interesting that we started to see some supply chain wonkiness pre-pandemic, but then obviously when coronavirus hit, you had factories that were being shut down. You had weird consumer demand stuff happening. So if you remember, I think in March of 2020, gas prices dropped to like $1 a gallon because nobody was driving anywhere. And then you had crazy demand for at-home services, delivery things. So you started to see the imbalance at the very beginning, but the government then reacted, and stimulus checks start going out. So now consumers are getting extra money, and they're starting to buy things. So when you think about our economy, it's made up of goods and services. Well, the goods pendulum started swinging out of control because nobody was doing anything in person anymore. And so I think those sort of early ripple effects have started to show up in other places.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to predict when things will come back to stasis, and if they will come back to stasis. I think they will, but I mean, that's the game everybody's playing is when do things go back to normal?
That's what we're here to banter about, right? What's interesting to me is you start looking at it, you start identifying the sensitivity in the supply chain. When supply and demand are relatively equal, no problem, no issue. When one gets out of balance, significant problems occur. And then you factor in a global pandemic as well as a plethora of other geo and social and economic, and it becomes this massive undertaking to try to figure out, all right, what is going on and how are we going to solve the issues in a way where we can get the train back on the tracks. And I think you know, when you said peel back the onion. If you start looking at the onion itself, you start identifying that these sensitivities always existed. There was just not much concern about them because the supply chain wasn't broken. So in the world that we live in, right, if it's like, hey, no, you know, look at health and wellness, right? Hey, I'm fine. I don't need to go to the doctor. And it's like, well, but at some point you're not going to be fine, right? Like you probably got to go get a baseline before you continue to run down that road, me specifically drinking bourbon. But you identify that the supply chain was unfortunately something that was created on a global basis to support demand, the supply of goods, and then the movement of those goods from countries that made things more affordable. And all of a sudden now you're in a position going, okay, well, that was pre-pandemic. That is something that was acceptable. Post-pandemic, what do we do? Because we can't get the goods. We have a backlog of demand, and supply is running short everywhere. And I think the issues that you start outlining are issues that are really driven around people, right? People, performance, and then this, you know, the underbelly of supply chain is manufacturing and distribution. So you start looking at these organizations that make things and move things for a living, which are the organizations that I'm innately familiar with because I spent almost 20 years building supply chains with organizations that do that. So,
well, you know, it's interesting. I've got a story that is extremely ironic in hindsight because the last year that I was at Big Ass Fans, the New York Times ran an article about our company, and it was a supply chain article. It was in the middle of all the tariff stuff, and the headline was, while Trump shrinks the world, I think it was, while Trump shrinks the world, Big Ass Fans goes global. And the whole idea was we were going to be penalized by the steel tariffs, but we were a U.S. manufacturer because there were only certain places you were going to be buying your steel from or your electronics. Because it's not like you had secondary suppliers that were stateside.
Yeah.
So the point of our message was we're being penalized even though we're creating jobs and economic activity in the U.S. And that's because we live in a world that's a global supply chain. So it's not that we were just outsourcing and trying to build our stuff as cheap as possible. It's just there were certain components that's where they came from. Well, you fast forward to the supply chain crisis, and my understanding is that Big Ass Fans actually started building their own PCBs in Lexington, Kentucky, to respond to the fact that it was going to take them more than a year to get what they needed from an electronic standpoint. And so you go from, we have to have this global supply chain because there's only certain places in the world that make these things, to we're going to vertically integrate as much as we can because we have to control our own destiny. We're growing right. And we can't fulfill. Which leads to my question. Do you see the next 10 years being one marked by increased globalization? Or do you think you're going to see, you know, the government taking control of supply chains and incentivizing stuff to be built here? Or do you think you're going to see companies trying to go more vertically integrated or some combination of those things?
I think you're going to see, and it's already happening, a complete reevaluation of the supply chain per industry, per company. And I think it's going to be a combination of all of that. You know, the pendulum swing to complete reliance on third parties or countries where there are significant political swings is a tough pill for a lot of organizations to swallow. I saw it in the lighting industry more than a decade ago. We saw the shift to LED, right? So fluorescent had already moved the needle to China, and with that, the manufacturing of the the chemicals that were necessary to make the fluorescent illuminate you couldn't mine in the U.S. So China said, absolutely. They became the dominant player in the lighting industry. And as LEDs started to hit the market, they became a catalyst for moving the lighting industry into a more cost-effective, more energy-efficient space. The issue that it drove, though, is a plethora of competition that crept out of nowhere. You would have, 4 or 5 major companies and, a couple dozen others that really dominated the marketplace. And then with the advent of China being the dominant player in the industry, you started having, hundreds of competitors and lots of niche lines and driving price down, which is good for the consumer, but tough for the organizations. So the reliance on that was tough. Then the tariffs hit. And all of a sudden it's like, well, hold on a second. Now what are we going to do? And we saw a shift from Asia to Central South America and Mexico. And it became a move, 1, for transportation logistics, 2, for tariffs, but 3, to ensure that you're not completely reliant on one party or a singular nation to ensure the success of your business.
Yeah, the geopolitical implications are so huge in all of this. And, what's crazy is in, call it the 80s, 90s, the trend of offshoring, specifically offshoring manufacturing. And you mentioned that some materials are just, you can't source them from certain countries. Well, the fear was that all, quote unquote, blue collar jobs were going to leave the States. And there was some of that was realized, but I think what you're going to see now is more of that coming here because we want to shore up our critical supply chains for components and to be able to build things, especially as relates to tech products.
Absolutely.
And you're starting to see the opposite happen in what you would consider knowledge work, where, with the rise of remote work and services like Fiverr and Upwork, you can tap into somebody anywhere in the world to perform tasks, whether it's data analysis or, even coding or whatever. And so almost the opposite is what I would expect over the next 10 years, to see more of a resurgence on the manufacturing and distribution side of the supply chain in the U.S., and then potentially some brain drain or outsourcing of knowledge work happening. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that's overstated, or we'll find some balance here?
Yeah, I don't think it's overstated at all. I think what we're going to identify in the coming decade, and of course this is, there's a lot of factors that go into this. But I think what we're seeing is the global adoption of service, right? The ability, specifically in technology, right? We're in the technology field. You have gigantic organizations all over the world now that are technology companies, software organizations. And they're doing business globally. There's no wall, there's no barrier, right? There's no good to move back and forth. So I think that is going to continue, and I think you're right. And we're already seeing it, right? Look at the Intel at the factory in Ohio. You've got Ford making a gigantic investment in EV here in Kentucky. So you have now this really interesting movement that's going on. But like I said, the pendulum, it swung far one way, and now it's starting to swing back. And what I want to, caution the world on is you can't let it all swing all the way back, because us thinking that we're going to be completely reliant on us is ludicrous. Those are things that are wonderful things to aspire to, but they don't make any financial, they don't make any political sense, right? There is a reason why we have the United Nations. There's a reason why, we depend on other countries to do certain things. And it goes back to, we use it all the time in the technology space, right? Like, let the people that do this the best do this the best, right? Let's take the best of a multitude of things to ensure that we have something that is maximized and optimized, instead of, we'll do that. Well, hold on, why would we do that when they could do that?
Yeah, it's always a balance. It's interesting. I think there are three things that are really going to separate the wheat from the chaff with regards to supply chain management. One is diversification. And I don't just mean in terms of suppliers, I mean in terms of the products and services you offer. Build resilience into your organization so that you're eliminating vulnerability. If one of your products goes sideways because the supply chain is cattywampus, then you've got other business arms that you can lean into. That's one. I would say transparency. What was the stat we were looking at? Like 6% of companies have complete visibility over their supply chain. Yeah. So you have to know, where you have potential issues and problems. And I think that's something that all companies are starting to pay attention to.
Agreed.
And then the third piece is communication. I think in certain businesses, it's certainly easier than in others, but when you can't communicate with your customer about what's going on, and that ties back to the transparency piece. When you don't know what's going on, sure, there's nothing to communicate. But when you do, you can really manage the customer experience by keeping them in the know so that they can plan. Uncertainty is one of the worst things in businesses. It kills businesses. So, the more clarity you can provide, the more communication you can provide, I think that also helps build resilience against some of these potential pitfalls that can occur in your supply chain.
Yeah, it's moved from, it's no longer a nice to have, specifically in the space that we live in B2B. Communication and transparency were things that, are still to this day being done via email and voicemail. So it's this, hold on a second. How are you, if we're talking right now today about how do you survive and thrive in this uncertainty, specifically around the supply chain? Because one entity is not going to go fix the supply chain. So all of the plethora of things that need to take place, and it's, we're talking years. This isn't something that is between now and the end of the year we're going to have all figured out and everybody's going to be back to normal. So what do you do as an organization? How do your people take this as an opportunity to differentiate yourself and your business in a very uncertain time? And it's really driven around the ability to take this uncertainty and bring calm to the storm, specifically for your customer base. And how do you do that? Well, you do it with transparency, right? You do it with communication, and you give people an opportunity now to truly create the service necessary that is bigger, better, faster. It might not be the product now because the product is slow, but the communication needs to be fast and the transparency needs to be there. And if you don't know, you don't know. The uncertainty of the supply chain is understood globally. So it's no longer I'll get back to you. And then you get an answer, 48 hours later and it's like, yeah, it's not good. Well, okay. I wish I would have known that 2 days ago. Well, I was trying to figure out how to soften the blow. And it was like, no, hey, it's not good. Here's what's going on. Here's what we're going to do for you. Here's the interim options. And then as we get this under control or have a better understanding, we're going to keep you in the loop as we know, period. And those are the companies that are going to thrive in this time.
Well, being the eternal optimist that I am, I think there are some really strong silver linings out of this. I think one is that there are going to be all kinds of jobs created around supply chain management. I think people are going to be studying it in school. I think you're going to have new roles in organizations that are focused on it, the analysis, the management of it, where previously it had been an afterthought. And I think you're going to have a lot of companies created, goods and services around managing the supply chain, creating that transparency we talked about, giving you communication tools to share with your customers what's going on, and getting that balance of lean but safe. You can go too lean where you're just in time and then you're very vulnerable. So I think there's going to be a lot of good economic tailwinds that actually come in over the next decade as people start to realize there's a lot of money in supply chain and supply chain management. And I'll be really interested to see the new tech companies, like I said, the new jobs that are created within organizations to manage it. And I think we'll end up being better for it.
100%. Out of uncertainty, usually always there's gems that are created. And these times are challenging, and the challenges usually create opportunity. And through the opportunity, the organizations have a unique path to become much better, period. If you're focused on it. There's also the other side of the coin, which is like, this is what we do and how we do it, and we just can't do it as well, and we're not focused on trying to figure out how to create unique customer experiences when you don't have product to physically ship. How to ensure that you're managing employee expectations and you're giving these people an opportunity to thrive in an organization that allow them a path forward. Right? The industry that I've lived in, you start identifying like it's time for change, and this disruption now is going to force change. And the companies that adopt the technology, the companies that invest in their people and that create diversity within their supply chain as well as their product and categories, and then, build better relationships, they're going to thrive in the next decade. So between now and 2030, I think you're going to see some real separation within the space, which over the course of 20 or 30 years has become significantly commoditized. And so now you have a unique opportunity to take this and run with it. Now the question is what are you going to do with that?
Well, never let a good crisis go to waste. I mean, if you can gain a competitive edge out of a supply chain strategy, I think that you'll see marketplace effects, come into play here. Businesses are always looking at ways to gain an edge, and you're right. I think maybe in the past, supply chain was more of an afterthought. But after the year or 3 years that we've had, I don't think there's anybody out there, company or individual, that's not thinking about supply chain. So
agreed.
Well, buddy, the bourbon was good, but the banter was even better.
Always, Alex.
Enjoyed it, and really looking forward to diving into our next topic.
Cheers.
Cheers.